in this way. Chapter 1 is Jonah running from God. Chapter 2 is Jonah running into God while he's in the belly of the fish. Chapter 3 is Jonah running with God as he goes to Nineveh to preach. But then we get to chapter 4. It's not a happy ending, where Jonah is trying to run God and tell God what he is to do. The book of Jonah, the story of Jonah, is more than simply a fish story. For it speaks to where we are in our relationship to God today. Little Jeffrey had acted up. So his father disciplined him, and Jeffrey decided he wanted no more of that. So he goes to his room, and he gets some of his clothes, his teddy bear, and his piggy bank, puts it all into a big sack, carries it out down the stairs, confronts his father, and says, "I'm running away from home." His father asked him, he says, "Well, what if you get hungry?" And little Jeffrey said, "I'll just come home and get something to eat." He says, "Well, what happens if you run out of money?" He says, "I'll just come home and get some money." "Well, what happens if your clothes get dirty?" And little Jeffrey says, "Well, I'll just come home and let Mama wash them." And Jeffrey's daddy says, "This boy's not running from home. He's going off to college." With that. Well, the truth is, we can be like Jeffrey with God. And we can be like Jeffrey when God may say something or do something we do not like, and we want our own way. We want life to be like we want it to be, and then we run. But here's a lesson I want you to hear. And we'll reiterate this a couple of times before we're finished. And the lesson is this: God will pursue you as He pursued Jonah. Because when it comes to God's will for your life, we can run, but we cannot hide from God. If you want to know what Jonah chapter 1 is all about, the truth is that Jonah was running from God. But Jonah could not hide from God. Let's begin reading just the first 3 verses of Jonah chapter 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria, Israel's great enemy. Assyria was not a nice country. It was not filled with nice people. In fact, Assyria was known for their wickedness, not only in their worship of other gods, but in how they treated their enemies. Whenever the Assyrians would take over a town, they would gather the survivors and then impale their bodies and then have them on display for anybody to see. They would gather their skulls and at the city gate have the skulls of their enemies all piled up so that you would know who was in charge. They got into the city. In fact, the leaders were so wicked, they would behead the leaders of their enemies and tie a string through their severed heads and wear them around their necks as a necklace. They were not nice people. And Nineveh was not listed as one of the top 10 places to visit when you go on vacation either. So I imagine Jonah is thinking, knowing all of this about Assyria, knowing all this about Nineveh, he hears God saying, "Arise and go speak to Nineveh." I can just imagine Jonah saying, "Now, hold on, God. Wait a minute. So you want me to go to these people and say bad things about Nineveh to their faces so they can just kill me painfully and slowly?" Instead, Jonah runs the other way. And not just the other way, but in the opposite direction. He's headed on a 2,500-mile journey to get as far away from Nineveh, to get as far away from Assyria as he can. Let me ask you, have you ever run from God? You know God is calling you to a specific thing, but out of fear or rebellion, you run in the opposite direction. Now, granted, the call of God upon your life may not be as dangerous as a place called Nineveh, but it is a call all the same. Maybe for you, it is a call to change your behavior. But instead, you do everything you can to avoid the topic. Maybe it is a call of God to be more public about your faith. Instead, whatever chance God gives you to be public about your faith, you hide and you take your light and you put it under a bushel. Maybe it is a call to forgive someone for harm they have done to you, but instead you avoid them at all costs so you can keep nursing that grudge that seems to make you feel so good. Or is a call to quietness and prayer. Instead, you fill your life with busy, unimportant things. A call to a specific ministry or the use of your spiritual gifts. Instead, you put it on the back burner until you deem the time to be more appropriate. Maybe for someone in this room. A call into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, but instead, you just keep throwing yourself into the things of the world. Jonah had this call of God upon his life, and he runs, but he cannot hide because God would not let him go. And I am so glad that when I try to run, that God is always pursuing me. That God always pursues me when I run because He knows the worst place I can be is outside of the will of God. Notice what happens now with verse 4. But the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was about to be broken up. And then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God and threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load. But Jonah had gone down into the lowest parts of the ship, had lain down, and was fast asleep. So the captain came to him and said to him, "What do you mean, sleeper? Arise, call on your God." Is that not the same thing God said in verse 1? In verse 2? Arise, go to Nineveh. And now the heathen are saying, "Arise and call on your God. Perhaps your God will consider us so that we may not perish." Friends, the truth is a Christian may sail on the wrong boat. He may head in the wrong direction. He may stow away. He may even reject and be reluctant to follow the Lord. Yet God does not give up on us. I want you to notice the extent to which God pursued this disobedient prophet. We're told that God sent a storm. Not just some wind and not just some lightning and thunder, but He sent a tempest. That is, He threw out a storm so great that these seasoned sailors were afraid for their lives. That God went so far as to change the course of all nature to bring His wayward prophet back to Him. Friends, never underestimate God's pursuit of you. Even if it means He has to put you into a storm to get your attention, He will do what it takes when you're trying to run from Him to pursue you, to bring you back. This is called harsh grace. It is harsh because it hurts, but it is grace because His intention for the storm is to draw you back to Himself, to draw you back into His will, to draw you back into your purpose for life for which He created you. Gospel singer Kirk Franklin says, "You should be happy about your troubles, for if it were not for your troubles, some of you would not even pray." God allows those things and even puts you in the midst of storms at times, not necessarily to punish you, but to get your attention, to draw you back to Himself. And for Jonah, this was literally a wake-up call for his life. For we're told Jonah was asleep down in the bottom of the boat. And here comes the captain. This man who had no clue about Jehovah God. Here was this captain, and he wakes Jonah, begging him to pray to his God. And Jonah's on the run. And the last thing Jonah wants to do is to talk to God. Let me tell you something, friends. When you are running from God, the first thing you abandon is your prayer life. When you're running from God, the last thing you want to do is to come into the presence of God and to speak to Him and to beg for His grace and His mercy and His peace. Jonah was running. He was in the midst of the storm. And even the heathen were saying, "Hey, why don't you pray to your God?" But Jonah, that's the last thing he wants. And it is interesting to see the contrast here. In the midst of the storm, the heathen were praying, but Jonah was sleeping. The heathen were trying to find God, but God's prophet is trying to flee from God. It is a microcosm of the church today. See, while the world around us is desperately trying anything and everything to find peace in their lives, trying to find anything and everything that will get them connected with some kind of God, God's people are asleep and disinterested in the spiritual conditions of the souls of people who are facing eternal damnation. While the storm is raging, and people are searching, the church, we simply fall asleep. Running from God, we do not even come to the point where we want to talk to God about it. Friends, let me show you what running from God would do to you. Running from God would cause you to have a deaf ear to the cries of others. You hear their cry, but you just set them aside. Running for God will blind your eyes to everything going on around you. Instead of seeing God's hand at work and how He's placing you in the midst of His work, you're blinded to see what God's doing. Running from God will dull your heart so you become insensitive to the voice of God and the needs of others. That was Jonah. Asleep in the bottom of the boat, in the midst of the storm, trying to get as far away from God as he could. Let's pick it up with verse 7. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots," that is, the sailors. "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know for whose cause this trouble has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Please tell us, for what cause is this trouble upon us? What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and what people, and of what people are you?" So he said to them, "I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "Why have you done this?" For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. They cast lots. And the lot fell on Jonah. They come to him and say, "What's up? What's going on? Why are we in this condition? What have you done to God?" And Jonah confesses he is running from God. But he says, "I'm a Hebrew." He says, "I fear the Lord, and I serve the God of heaven. I serve the Creator." Now, it seems like things just are not meshing. What he says about who he is in God does not match up with what he's doing with God. He said, "I fear God and I serve him," on one hand. Then the next breath he says, "But I'm running for the Lord." He says it, but he's not living it. You know, we're kind of like Jonah at times. We're good at keeping up appearances. We go to church, we say the right things, we do the right things, and we profess to others that we are followers of Jesus Christ. Then, like these sailors, they watch how we live our lives, and they wonder, why are you doing and acting like you're acting? Because you told me you love God and you follow Him. Then why is that how you act? Why are you doing what you're doing? See, the easiest thing for us when you run from God is to feel guilty about your sin and then come to church on a Sunday morning and you sit and you listen to the preacher, you sing the songs, you lift your hands, you lift your voices in praise, but all the time on the inside, in the midst of your heart, you are running far from God. And you walk out of the room saying, "Well, did that," but there's no difference that's been made in your life. There's no peace, there's no struggle to know God. Because let me give you another indication that you're running from God. When you're running from God, your worship is empty. When you're running from God, you can sing the songs, but the words do not affect your spirit. When you run from God, your worship is empty. And in the end, running from God placed Jonah in a far more desperate, dangerous place than going to Nineveh. Let's catch it back up with verse 11. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may be calm for us?" For the sea was growing more tempestuous. And he said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that this great tempest is because of me." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to return to land, but they could not, for the sea continued to grow more tempestuous against them. You ever feel like you're rowing hard? The storm's there, and you're trying to figure out how to get it done yourself, trying to get out of the storm in your own ways and your own means, but the storm just gets worse. When we do it our way instead of God's way, the storm always rages. Verse 14. They turned to the Lord. Therefore they cried out to the Lord and said, "We pray, O Lord, please do not let us perish for this man's life, and do not charge us with innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. And then the men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice to the Lord and took vows. They quit rowing. They cast Jonah into the sea. The sea stops raging, and the sailors fall on their knees worshiping Jonah's God, promising to serve him. Now here's the interesting thing. These men recognized the absolute power of Jonah's God. And they ran to God, unlike Jonah, who was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore. God, though, is gracious to Jonah. Instead of leaving him to drown in the midst of the sea, instead of leaving him to die, God places in his pathway a great fish to swallow Jonah to preserve his life. Verse 17. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. What a terrible place to be. See, when we run from God, and when God causes the storm to come to draw us back to Him, watch this. He will always provide a way out. As a child of God, when you run from God and He brings a storm, He's not there to end your relationship with Him, but He provides for you a way out. It may be as smelly as a belly of a fish, but it is deliverance nonetheless. So what's our lesson? What's the lesson of this first chapter of Jonah? The lesson is we have a God of grace who pursues you with a passion because He loves you and desires for you to be in perfect fellowship with Him. So the question naturally comes in, are you running from God? Has God clearly revealed to you what is His will for your life? What His purpose and plan for you is? Has God clearly revealed that to you, but yet you have said no? See, I can clearly identify with Jonah. God worked in a similar fashion in my own life throughout my teenage years and into my young adulthood. I came to Christ at the age of 9. But then at the age of 12, all the way to the age of 18, I was running from God. If you'd asked me, I would have told you I'm not interested in what God may want to do with my life. I had no concern for what His plan might be for me. I was an angry teenager. I was an angry young man. Angry at my parents, angry at life. I was angry at God. I was so angry at God and my parents that living in Brownwood, Texas, at the end of my sophomore year of high school, my father announces we're moving to San Antonio. Right before my junior and senior years at high school, right when I finally had a girlfriend, my father says, we're leaving and we're going. So we head down the road, find a place in San Antonio, the northeast side, and my parents say this to me. My parents said, we're going to join whatever church you want us to join. I could care less about church. And so I made up my mind, the first one to go to, that's the one I'm going to say because I don't want to go to any more. And this way we can get it done and over with, and I can just not go to that church just like I didn't want to go to the church back home. First church we visit, Crestview Baptist Church, San Antonio, Texas. Is this a church you want to join? Yes. So what do? We join the church. Why? Because I wanted a church to help move me and mold me and shape me? No. I was an angry young man running from God. You don't know how angry, you don't see how angry I was? Watch this. That's my junior year in high school. My ID card for Theodore Roosevelt High School. I'd already cut my hair by that time. But every time I look at that picture, I see Jonah. An angry young man running from God. He wanted to have nothing to do with what God wanted for me. But God, though, did not give up on Mark Lindsay. He worked providentially and persistently to get my attention and to turn me in the right direction. Hey, that church we joined that I didn't want to join, it was the closest one to the house that my parents had found to live in northeast San Antonio. Why that house? Because God wanted to get me here to this church. Because in that church, God put in my pathway people who loved me in spite of who I was, in spite of how angry I was. And we got involved in that church. And during my senior year in high school, I realized I was running from God's purpose and plan for me. And sometime during that senior year in high school, our church had what was called a lay renewal weekend, a revival. But we didn't invite a preacher to come in and preach and a song leader to come in and lead music. A whole group of people from another church somewhere in North Texas came down and said, hey, we want to walk alongside of you. And we're just going to do life together for about 4 days. And they did. And God had taken me out of a storm and put me in the belly of a fish called Crestview Baptist Church. And when God finally spit me up on dry land, He spit me right at the feet of these people from this church who love me unconditionally. And I put my hands in it and said, I surrender. I surrender. And God welcomed me home. And He gave me another chance. You see, I learned through all that. You can run from God, but you cannot hide from God. All those years in high school that I was trying to get as far away from God as I wanted to, God was hot on my tail. He was pursuing me. He was changing circumstances of my life and the life of my family in order to turn me into this storm that would get my attention. I tried to run, but I could not hide. God was there. I didn't always see Him. I didn't always know it. I did not always understand it, but God was there. And friends, if you are running from God, I want you to know, hey, you can't run faster from God than God can run with you. You think you're hiding? The Father knows who you are, where you are. He knows what you're going through. And for some of you right now, you're battling a storm. And God's providing a way out if you'll just turn to Him. I learned another lesson. And it took me a while to quit beating myself up over this. But the lesson I learned was, why did I ever try to run from God in the first place? Why did I even try it? Friends, if you are running from God, then I would say to you, stop where you are and turn around and go back home to where you belong. You want to know how far it takes for you to get home with God? It takes one step. You may have run away from home for years and years and think, I've got to do something to make up those